He thought he was alone in that cabin, until a broken voice asked him not to look. What he saw next changed everything, and set off a chain of events neither of them could have expected. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The harsh winter of 1879 had descended upon the Montana Territory with a vengeance. Thomas Blackwood pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he guided his horse through the relentless blizzard. The wind howled like a wounded beast, carrying snow that stung his weathered face. His ranch was only a mile ahead, but in this white hell, it might as well have been 100. Thomas had been a rancher for 15 years, building his modest spread from nothing after returning from the war. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened, and flecks of gray peppered his dark beard. He was respected in the nearby town of Pinecrest for his fair dealings and steady nature, though few knew the loneliness that had become his constant companion. "Come on, Shadow," he urged his black stallion. "Just a little further, boy." The horse trudged forward, its breath visible in the frigid air. Thomas squinted through the curtain of white, desperately searching for any sign of his cabin. When a faint light finally appeared in the distance, relief washed over him. As he approached his property, something seemed amiss. The barn door swung wildly in the wind. He was certain he'd secured it before leaving. More concerning was a set of footprints leading to his cabin, already being obscured by fresh snow. Who'd be fool enough to be out in this? He muttered, dismounting carefully. Thomas led Shadow into the barn, quickly tending to the exhausted animal. His other horses nickered in greeting, seemingly undisturbed. After ensuring Shadow was properly settled, Thomas retrieved his Winchester rifle from its saddle holster and approached his cabin with caution. The wooden steps creaked beneath his boots as he climbed onto the porch. The door was unlocked, another troubling sign. Thomas took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the rifle, and pushed the door open. The cabin was dark save for the dying embers in the fireplace. Thomas stood still, listening intently. A soft sound came from the corner, breathing. Someone was there. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Show yourself." Silence followed, then a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "Please ... don't look at me yet." Thomas frowned, reaching for the oil lamp on the table by the door. "I'm lighting this lamp, ma'am, and then you'll explain why you've broken into my home." "Please," the voice pleaded again, a hint of desperation coloring the word. Thomas struck a match and lit the lamp. As warm light flooded the cabin, he froze in place. In the corner, huddled beneath his spare blanket, was a young woman. What caught his attention wasn't her presence, but her condition. Her face was marked with bruises, one eye swollen nearly shut. Her split lip had crusted with dried blood, and she held herself in a way that suggested more injuries hidden beneath the blanket. Thomas lowered his rifle immediately. "Good Lord, miss. What happened to you?" The woman flinched at his movement. "I'm sorry for intruding," she said, her voice hoarse. "The storm. I had nowhere else to go. Who did this to you?" Thomas asked, setting the lamp down and keeping his distance, recognizing the fear in her one good eye. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "I just need somewhere to rest before I move on tomorrow." Thomas studied her for a moment. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with dark hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. Despite her injuries, there was a dignity in how she held herself. "You're not going anywhere in this storm," Thomas said firmly. "And you need medical attention. I'm Thomas Blackwood. This is my ranch." After a moment's hesitation, she replied, Catherine Wilson." "Well, Miss Wilson, I've got some medicinal supplies. Not much, but enough to clean those wounds." Thomas moved slowly toward the kitchen area. "Are you hungry?" Catherine nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. "Thank you." As Thomas stoked the fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and leftover venison, he kept his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd endured too much, in wild horses that had been mistreated. Trust would come slowly, if at all. The nearest town is Pinecrest, about 10 miles south, Thomas explained as he worked. There's a doctor there, but we won't be able to reach him until this storm passes. I can't go to town, Catherine said quickly, panic edging into her voice. Please, I just need to rest and then I'll be on my way. Thomas brought her a plate of food and set it down nearby, then backed away to give her space. You're running from someone. It wasn't a question, but Catherine answered anyway. Yes. Your husband? Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine's silence was answer enough. You're safe here, Miss Wilson, Thomas said quietly. Eat, rest. We'll figure out what comes next when the storm passes. As Catherine cautiously reached for the plate, Thomas noticed the wedding band on her finger, and beneath it, the dark bruises around her wrist. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Outside, the blizzard raged on, isolating the cabin in a world of white, creating a temporary sanctuary for a woman who had clearly risked everything to escape. 3 days passed, and the blizzard showed no signs of relenting. Thomas had offered Catherine his bed, taking the small cot in the corner for himself. Each day, they fell into a quiet routine. Thomas would tend to the animals in the morning, returning with fresh milk and eggs from the small henhouse attached to the barn. Catherine, despite her injuries, insisted on helping around the cabin, cooking, mending clothes, and generally keeping busy. They spoke little at first, but as the hours stretched into days, words began to flow more freely between them. Thomas learned that Catherine came from Boston originally, that she had married James Wilson, a successful businessman from Helena, 2 years ago. The bruises told the rest of the story, though Catherine offered few details. He has connections, she explained on the third evening as they sat by the fire. Her face was beginning to heal, the swelling around her eye reduced enough that she could open it partially. In Helena, in the territory government, no one would help me. Thomas nodded, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. How did you end up here? Catherine stared into the flames. I took money from his safe. Enough for a stagecoach ticket south. I was heading to my cousin in Colorado, but the stage had to stop in Pinecrest because of the weather. She paused, her fingers absently tracing the fading bruises on her wrist. I heard men in town asking about me. James must have telegraphed ahead. I panicked, stole a horse, and just rode. When the storm got worse, I saw your cabin lights. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Thomas said, his eyes on the wooden figure taking shape in his hands. Catherine studied him curiously. You live here alone? A shadow passed over Thomas's face. I do now. My wife Sarah passed 6 years ago. Fever took her. I'm sorry, Catherine said softly. Thomas nodded his acknowledgement. We had no children. Just me and the ranch now. He gestured around the cabin. It's not much, but it's honest work. It's peaceful, Catherine observed. Different from city life. Most days, Thomas agreed with a slight smile. Though the wolves get bold in winter and cattle thieves in summer. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden howl of wind that rattled the windows. Catherine tensed, her gaze darting to the door. Just the storm, Thomas reassured her. No one's coming through that. He won't stop looking, Catherine whispered. James doesn't tolerate what he sees as disobedience. Thomas set down his carving, a small horse that was beginning to take recognizable form. What happened? The night you left. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. He had been drinking, more than usual. I served dinner late because I'd visited a friend that afternoon and lost track of time. He ... She took a deep breath. He broke my arm once before. I knew what was coming. But this time, I saw something different in his eyes. I truly believed he might kill me. Thomas remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. When he finally fell asleep, I packed a small bag, took money from his safe, and left. I didn't plan it. I just knew I couldn't be there when he woke up. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've never stolen anything before. You didn't steal, Thomas said firmly. You survived. The following morning, Thomas awoke to find Catherine at the stove, preparing breakfast. The storm had finally broken overnight, leaving an eerie stillness outside. Sunlight glinted off the blanket of snow covering the landscape. "I need to ride into town," Thomas announced after they'd eaten. "We're running low on supplies, and I should check if any fences went down in the storm." Fear flashed across Catherine's face. "Is it safe?" Thomas understood her concern. "I won't mention you, but I need to know if there's talk. If your husband's men are still searching." Catherine nodded reluctantly. "What should I do if someone comes while you're gone?" Thomas walked to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a revolver. He handed it to Catherine. "Do you know how to use this?" Catherine took the weapon, her grip surprisingly confident. "My father taught me, before I was married." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. "There's a cellar trapdoor under the rug in the bedroom. If anyone comes, hide there. Use this only if you must." As Thomas prepared to leave, saddling Shadow in the crisp morning air, Catherine stood in the doorway of the cabin. The sunlight illuminated her face, and Thomas noticed for the first time the natural beauty beneath the fading bruises, high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and a quiet strength that had survived despite everything. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, mounting his horse. Catherine nodded, clutching the shawl around her shoulders. "Be careful, Mr. Blackwood." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "After sharing a cabin for 3 days, I think we can dispense with formalities." A small smile touched Catherine's lips. "Thomas, then." As he rode toward Pinecrest, Thomas couldn't help but glance back at the diminishing figure of Catherine standing in the doorway of his cabin. Something protective stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The isolated ranch had felt emptier since Sarah's passing, but now, with Catherine's presence, it seemed to have regained something vital. The snow-covered trail to town was difficult but passable. Thomas's mind raced with thoughts of Catherine's situation and what might come next. If her husband was as connected as she claimed, hiding her wouldn't be simple. Yet the alternative, sending her back to a man who might kill her, was unthinkable. Thomas had always considered himself a law-abiding man, but as Pinecrest came into view, he realized he was prepared to bend those principles to keep Catherine safe. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders as he guided Shadow down the main street, eyes alert for any strangers who might be looking for a runaway wife. Pinecrest was bustling with activity after the storm. Townspeople cleared snow from boardwalks, merchants restocked their shelves, and the saloon was already doing brisk business despite the early hour. Thomas tied Shadow outside the general store, nodding to familiar faces as he entered. Thomas Blackwood. Henry Miller, the store owner, greeted him warmly. "Thought you might have been buried alive in that blizzard." "Nearly was," Thomas replied, removing his hat. "Need to restock. Got a list here." As Henry gathered the items, Thomas casually asked, "Any strangers passed through town recently? Before or after the storm?" Henry paused, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. "Matter of fact, there were some city types asking questions a few days back. Well-dressed fellows, not the usual travelers." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman," Henry said, placing sacks of flour and coffee on the counter. "Said she was a runaway wife who'd stolen family valuables. Offered a reward for information." Thomas's heart quickened. "Anyone claim it?" "Not that I heard," Henry replied. "Though they left descriptions with Sheriff Donovan. Said they'd be back once the trail's cleared." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Between us, they didn't seem the trustworthy sort." "Something off about them," Thomas nodded, paying for his supplies. "Appreciate the information, Henry." His next stop was the sheriff's office. Robert Donovan had been Pinecrest sheriff for over a decade, and Thomas considered him a fair man, if somewhat rigid in his adherence to the letter of the law. "Thomas," Donovan greeted him, looking up from paperwork. "Good to see you made it through the storm." "Barely," Thomas replied, settling into a chair across from the sheriff's desk. "Heard there were some men looking for a woman." Donovan's expression tightened slightly. "News travels fast." "Small town," Thomas reminded him. "What's the story?" The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. 3 men from Helena, representing James Wilson. You might have heard of him. Wealthy businessman, has the ear of the territorial governor. And the woman? His wife, Catherine Wilson. Apparently she took off with family heirlooms and money. Wilson wants her back and the stolen property returned. Donovan studied Thomas carefully. Any particular reason you're asking? Thomas shrugged casually. Just curious about strangers in town, especially ones offering rewards. They left this, Donovan said, sliding a paper across the desk. Thomas looked down at a sketch of Catherine. It was a good likeness, though it depicted her without the bruises that had marked her face when she arrived at his cabin. Pretty woman, Thomas commented, keeping his voice level. Indeed, Donovan agreed. Wilson's men were quite insistent. Said she was delicate and prone to flights of fancy. Claimed she needed to be returned home for her own good. Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral. And you believe that? Donovan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Didn't say I did. But they had papers, marriage certificate, a letter from Wilson, even one from a doctor suggesting the woman suffered from female hysteria. All very official. Papers can lie, Thomas said quietly. True enough, Donovan conceded. But without evidence to the contrary, I can't ignore a legitimate complaint of theft. If she shows up here, I'd have to at least question her. He leaned forward. Why the interest, Thomas? You see something on your ranch? Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Just wondering what kind of man sends hired guns after his wife instead of coming himself. Donovan nodded slowly. A fair question. The men said they'd return in a week if the weather cleared. Mentioned checking outlying areas too. Thomas stood, placing his hat back on his head. Appreciate the information, Robert. Thomas, Donovan called as he reached the door. If you know something, be careful. Wilson has connections that reach far beyond Helena. Thomas acknowledged the warning with a nod before stepping back into the cold air. His mind raced as he loaded his supplies onto Shadow. Catherine had been right about her husband's influence. The papers the men carried would give their search legitimacy, making it nearly impossible for her to seek official help. At the saloon, Thomas gathered additional information. The bartender, Joe, confirmed that Wilson's men had spent freely, buying drinks for locals while asking questions about a dark-haired woman traveling alone. One of them got liquored up, Joe confided, wiping down the bar. Started talking about how Wilson would teach his wife respect when they brought her back. Didn't sound like a concerned husband to me. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had learned enough to worry him deeply. He purchased additional ammunition at the gunsmith's shop before heading back to the ranch, pushing Shadow to maintain a steady pace despite the difficult conditions. As the cabin came into view, relief washed over him at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney. Catherine appeared in the doorway as he approached, her expression anxious. They were here, she said without preamble, once he'd dismounted. 2 men on horseback. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his gun. When? About an hour ago. I hid in the cellar, like you said. Catherine hugged herself tightly. They looked around the property but didn't enter the cabin. I think they assumed it was empty with you gone. Thomas unloaded the supplies quickly, bringing everything inside before securing Shadow in the barn. Once back in the cabin, he bolted the door and moved to the window, scanning the surrounding area. They're in town, Thomas confirmed grimly. 3 of them, with papers claiming you stole family valuables. Catherine sank into a chair. James's grandmother's jewelry. He gave it to me when we married, then accused me of stealing it when I left. Her hands trembled slightly. What do we do now? Thomas sat across from her. They plan to search the outlying areas. They'll be back. I should leave, Catherine said, rising abruptly. I've put you in enough danger. Thomas shook his head. Where would you go? The trails are barely passable, and they're watching the roads. I can't ask you to risk yourself for me, Catherine insisted. These men, they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who stands in their way. I'm not asking your permission, Thomas replied firmly. I fought in the war, Catherine. I know something about standing my ground. Their eyes met across the table, a moment of understanding passing between them. Something had changed during the days they'd spent together, a connection neither had anticipated. "There's a place," Thomas said finally. "An old line shack about 15 miles into the foothills. Used it during summer grazing before I scaled back the herd. Few people know about it. We could leave at first light, stay there until we figure out our next move." Catherine studied him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to be unable to protect someone you care about." He looked away, memories of Sarah's final days clouding his eyes. "I couldn't save my wife from illness, but I can help you." As night fell, they prepared for the journey ahead. Thomas cleaned his weapons while Catherine packed food and essential supplies. They worked in companionable silence, each drawing strength from the other's presence. Later, as they sat by the fire, Thomas handed Catherine the small wooden horse he had finished carving. "Something to remember this place by," he said quietly, "whatever happens." Catherine ran her fingers over the detailed figure. "It's beautiful," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes that no longer held only fear, but something warmer, something hopeful. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling around the cabin's eaves like a warning. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but for now, in the warmth of the firelight, they had found a moment of peace in a world determined to deny it to them. Dawn broke cold and clear. Thomas and Catherine worked efficiently, loading 2 horses with supplies. Thomas had decided against taking the direct trail to the line shack, instead planning a circuitous route that would be harder to track, especially with fresh snow covering the ground. "Can you ride well enough?" Thomas asked, eyeing Catherine's still healing injuries. She nodded, adjusting the saddle on the chestnut mare Thomas had prepared for her. "I grew up riding in Boston. It's been a while, but I remember." They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the pristine landscape. Thomas led the way, constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. Catherine rode slightly behind, her face partially concealed by a woolen scarf against the bitter cold. "We'll follow the creek bed for a few miles," Thomas explained, guiding Shadow down a gentle slope. "It's harder terrain, but it won't hold tracks as clearly." Catherine nodded, focusing on maintaining her seat as her horse navigated the uneven ground. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft huffing of the horse's breath in the frigid air. As they entered a narrow ravine, Thomas suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. He tilted his head, listening intently. "What is it?" Catherine whispered, tension evident in her voice. "Horses," Thomas replied grimly. "More than one. Coming from the north." Catherine's face paled. "The direction of your ranch." Thomas nodded, quickly assessing their options. The ravine offered limited cover, and turning back would lead them directly toward the approaching riders. "This way," he decided, guiding them toward a dense stand of pines that climbed the eastern slope of the ravine. "We'll use the trees for cover." They urged their mounts up the steep incline, branches whipping at their faces as they entered the forest. Thomas helped Catherine dismount, then secured both horses to a tree well within the tree line. "Stay with the horses," he instructed, removing his rifle from its saddle holster. "I'm going to see who's following us." "Be careful," Catherine whispered, her hand briefly touching his arm. Thomas made his way back to the edge of the trees, finding a position that offered a clear view of the ravine below while keeping him concealed. Within minutes, 3 riders appeared, moving slowly along the creek bed. Thomas immediately recognized 2 of them as the men Catherine had described seeing at the ranch. The third, riding slightly ahead, was unfamiliar. They stopped directly below his position, examining the ground carefully. "Tracks lead this way," the lead rider announced. 2 horses heading east." "Must be her," one of the others replied. "That rancher from town must be helping her." The third man spat into the snow. "Wilson's paying extra if we bring back the man who's hiding his wife. Says he wants to handle him personally." Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. The men below weren't simply hired to find Catherine. They were bounty hunters, and dangerous ones at that. They're heading for the foothills, the leader observed. Probably making for one of the old mining settlements. We can cut them off if we circle around through Sawyer's Pass. Thomas retreated silently back to where Catherine waited with the horses, her expression anxious. James's men? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Thomas nodded grimly. 3 of them. They're planning to cut us off at Sawyer's Pass. He quickly untied the horses. We need to change our route. They mounted again, with Thomas leading them deeper into the forest, away from their original path. The going was slower among the trees, but it offered better concealment. The line shack is too obvious a destination now, Thomas explained as they rode. There's an abandoned trapper's cabin further into the mountains. Few people know about it. We'll head there instead. The day wore on, the sun climbing to its zenith before beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Thomas pushed them hard, knowing they needed to reach shelter before nightfall. Catherine rode without complaint, though he could see the toll the journey was taking on her still healing body. As they crossed a high meadow, Thomas suddenly reined in shadow, his expression alert. "What is it?" Catherine asked, pulling alongside him. "Smoke," Thomas said, pointing to a thin gray line rising above the trees to the northeast. "Could be a campfire. The men following us?" Thomas shook his head. "Wrong direction. They were heading for Sawyer's Pass." He studied the smoke thoughtfully. "Might be trappers or prospectors. Or more of James's men," Catherine suggested grimly. "He has the resources to hire multiple search parties." Thomas considered their options. The smoke was close to their current route, but avoiding it would mean taking a much longer path through difficult terrain. "We'll approach carefully," he decided. "If it's strangers, they might not have heard about the search for you. Could be valuable to know what's happening." They proceeded cautiously, leaving the horses tied in a protected hollow before continuing on foot. Thomas led the way, moving silently through the underbrush with the skill of a man accustomed to tracking game. Catherine followed, matching his care with each step. As they neared the source of the smoke, voices became audible. A man and a woman, their tones conversational rather than threatening. Thomas signaled for Catherine to remain hidden while he crept closer. The camp came into view, a simple arrangement with a small fire and 2 figures huddled nearby. To Thomas's surprise, he recognized them. Jacob and Mary Turner, an elderly couple who ran the post office in Pinecrest. Thomas turned to Catherine, whispering, "It's the Turners from town. Probably checking their trap lines. They're good people." "Can we trust them?" Catherine asked, uncertainty clear in her voice. Thomas considered the question seriously. "Jacob fought for the Union. He's a man of principles. And Mary has never had patience for men who mistreat women." After a moment's hesitation, Catherine nodded. "If you trust them, so will I." They approached the camp openly, Thomas calling out a greeting to avoid startling the couple. Jacob reached for his rifle until he recognized Thomas, then broke into a welcoming smile. "Thomas Blackwood, what brings you up to these parts?" His smile faltered as he noticed Catherine, taking in her fading bruises. Understanding dawned in his weathered face. Mary rose immediately, moving toward Catherine. "You poor dear. Come sit by the fire." As the women settled by the warmth, Thomas explained the situation to Jacob in low tones. The older man listened intently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Those men came to the post office," Jacob confirmed, asking if anyone had seen a woman matching her description. Mary sensed something wasn't right about them. He glanced toward the women. "We've heard rumors about James Wilson. None of them good. They're armed and determined," Thomas said. "Catherine needs to get to safety, somewhere beyond Wilson's reach." Jacob thought for a moment. "My brother runs a trading post near Fort Benton. It's the last stop before Canada. If you could get her there ... double quotes, Canada," Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "Wilson's influence might not extend across the border." As they discussed possibilities, Mary approached, her arm protectively around Catherine's shoulders. "Jacob, we need to help them," she stated firmly. "No woman should have to live in fear of her husband." Jacob nodded. "I was just telling Thomas about Timothy's place near Fort Benton." Mary's face brightened. "Yes. And the stagecoach heading north passes through Richardson's Crossing tomorrow. If you could reach it, ... Their planning was interrupted by the distant sound of a horse's nickering. Everyone froze, listening intently. "Could be just a wild horse," Jacob suggested, though his hand moved toward his rifle. Thomas shook his head. "Our horses are secured in a hollow east of here." That sound came from the west. Without a word, they extinguished the fire. Jacob quickly gathered essential items while Mary helped Catherine prepare to move. "There's a cave system about a mile north," Jacob told Thomas, keeping his voice low. "Used to hide escaping slaves during the war. Few people know about it." Thomas nodded gratefully. "We'll head there. What will you do?" "Create a distraction," Jacob replied grimly. "Lead them away from you." Catherine approached Thomas, her expression determined despite the fear visible in her eyes. "We should go." As they prepared to leave, Mary pressed something into Catherine's hand, a small locket. "For luck," the older woman whispered. "And to remember that there are still good people in this world." The two couples parted ways in the gathering dusk, each heading in a different direction. Thomas and Catherine moved swiftly through the forest toward their hidden horses, then continued north toward the caves Jacob had described. They reached the cave entrance as darkness fell completely. Thomas created a small, well-shielded fire just inside the opening, its light barely visible from outside, but providing enough warmth to ward off the mountain chill. As they sat side by side, sharing a simple meal of jerky and biscuits, Catherine opened Mary's locket. Inside was a tiny compass. "A direction forward," Catherine murmured, a small smile touching her lips. Thomas studied her face in the firelight. The bruises were fading, and with them, some of the fear that had haunted her eyes when they first met. "Tomorrow we'll make for Richardson's Crossing," Thomas said. "The stagecoach can take you to Fort Benton, and from there to Canada." Catherine looked up at him. "And you?" Thomas poked at the fire with a stick. "I'll lead Wilson's men away from your trail. Make them think we headed west instead." "You'd risk yourself again?" Catherine asked softly. "I would," Thomas replied simply. Catherine was silent for a long moment. "What if ... She began hesitantly. "What if I asked you to come with me?" The question hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Thomas looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had appeared in his cabin during the storm, but a potential future he had never expected to find again. "To Canada?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Catherine nodded. "I know it's asking too much. You have your ranch, your life here, but these past days ... She trailed off, unable to fully express what had grown between them. Thomas reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. "My father always said a ranch is just land and buildings. Home is something else entirely." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of another storm. But inside the cave, in the warm circle of firelight, two people who had expected to face their futures alone found themselves planning one together, beyond the reach of those who would keep them apart. As the fire burned low, Thomas made a decision. "We'll leave at first light. Together." Catherine's smile, genuine and hopeful, was like sunrise after the longest night. "Together," she agreed, her hand tightening around his. In that moment, despite the dangers that still lay ahead, they had found something neither had dared hope for again, a chance to begin anew, to build a life defined not by what they were running from, but by what they were running toward.